We now come to the two-way dialogue segment of the forum, and we'd like to hear from you. We'd like your questions directed at the panelists, and I do believe we have a microphone that will be circulated through the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll bring the microphone over to you. I'm going to start things off, though. I'd like to pick up on your last point. It was a question, really, and I'd like you to answer it.
Okay. It's clear that some groups in society have a strong sense of who they are. Mm-hmm. Now, for some people, I mean, if we just move away from our immediate focus, some people, sexuality is a very important feature of who they are. In particular, I mean, we all value our sexuality, but in particular in social terms, where they're a minority, where they see an environment in which they're often invisibilized or worse, stigmatized. You know, I'm talking about gay people and so on. Now, when they resist that environment and when they just try to be themselves, they emphasize a certain identity. They want to associate with other people in order to build up that identity, because these identities don't drop from the sky, and just me saying something about me being gay doesn't fill it out. This happens collectively. We think through these things in dialogue with each other, in collaboration and in group mobilization, and then they may have a political agenda that they want to put to the rest of society, to the politicians and so on. So I think personally that Muslims are such a group, not the only one by any means, but they are the most prominent, the largest in just numbers, and at the moment, obviously for all kinds of reasons, the most politically challenging. And I think that if we just say, yes, we want everybody to be integrated as individuals, you know, we don't want to know about whether you're a Muslim or whether you're black or your family's from India or anything like that. You're just, you know, you're just a German citizen, you're just a British citizen and so on. I don't think we will achieve full accommodation and integration of those groups. I think they will feel alienated, and they'll feel that the governmental system is stacked against them, and therefore we'll be building a division in our democracies which can turn out to be long-term divisions.
So Keith, does the focus become one of economic solutions or cultural?
Well, there's no question that issues of economic integration are central, and that if one is comparing Canadian and European experience and problems at the moment, one has to sort of start with that being an important difference. Difference in the immigration policies and flows, and difference in the economic level of economic integration of immigrants is a powerful difference between the two continents. It's not at all surprising that Europeans should be concerned about levels of integration and want to encourage that. That's clearly a very sensible move. The issue then becomes whether that's sufficient and whether a multicultural strategy can facilitate that. And that's, I think, where there probably is a bigger difference between the Canadian and European experiences. I mean, we've put a lot of support, and also how much support we'll give to immigrants in that integration process. Canada still pours substantial public money into assisting settlement and language acquisition for newcomers. And that's more controversial as an issue, whether the immigrant, the newly arrived immigrant, the people you want to integrate, whether all of that burden falls exclusively on the migrant, or whether the person, the society as a whole should be providing substantial resources to help make that transition. There's a big debate about that issue in Europe.
Taking a step back from that for a moment and looking at the term multiculturalism, Will, I'd like to ask you whether it's a term that has become fraught and whether it's worthwhile preserving it at this point.
Well, I think in some countries the term multiculturalism has been poisoned. It's just the political backlash against it which in many countries started with the right, maybe even the extreme right, populist parties. The center and the center left has come to share in the demonizing of multiculturalism. And so that in some countries, if you identify yourself as trying to advance a multiculturalist project in the face of this almost cross-party opposition to multiculturalism, you're just condemning yourself to irrelevance or marginalization. And so I think it's not surprising that in some European countries, advocates for pluralism are trying to find an alternative term. And I understand that. I think in the Canadian case, and probably also the British case, that the term has not yet been poisoned, has not yet been demonized, and that and it is worth fighting to keep it, and that I think Canada has made some progress through in the way we've understood our country as a multicultural country. That reframing of our national identity has actually taken root in large parts of the population, and has had beneficial effects. And that so I would resist efforts to get rid of the term here in Canada.
Okay, thank you. We have a question over here. Please tell us your name, sir, and let me know which panelist you'd like to direct your question to.
My name is Norman Moyer. For years I was a senior administrator in government responsible for our multiculturalism programs. I want to thank the Global Center for Pluralism for bringing this debate here, and our panelists for being optimistic about something that is far too often maligned today, and which I think is essential to the ongoing evolution of Canada as a nation. But I am happy to hear that it seems to be a model that's still valid elsewhere in the world. I can't say who my question is for. I'm going to posit what I think is an additional leg on the stool of multiculturalism that to me seems important. It comes from reading of Amin Malouf's Identité meurtrière, and in that he explores why some societies are more successful in receiving settlers and immigrants and some are less. And he comes up with a concept of cultural reciprocity that links to something that I think I am hearing echoes from in the panel, that the process of immigration and integration is not a one-way street, and that part of the success in the Canadian model is that, in fact, the majority is agreeing to change at the same time that it is inviting the people that arrive to change. Not as much. It's demonstrating a certain confidence in itself in the reception of immigration, but it is that, what I call the moving center, that matters in the success of the model. If anybody wants to try to comment on that, I'd be delighted to hear.
I think actually we can start with Keith. You have done some work identifying.
I agree. And I should just stop there, but being an academic, I won't. The idea that immigration is a two-way street, or integration, sorry, is a two-way street is quite a common observation, and it's common in many countries, but it sometimes means different things. The expression that or the way you expressed it, I think is more consistent with the Canadian conception of what a two-way street is like, because it says that the immigrant, the newcomer, must adjust, must change, but it says the mainstream institutions and culture must also change. So that the historic settled population must change to make the integration process easier. The institutions have to change so that newcomers can move into them more clearly. So that's the Canadian version of a two-way street. In some countries, there's what I would call a less ambitious conception of a two-way street, which says that the newcomers must adjust to the new society and new context, and the host society should provide resources to help them do that, providing support for language acquisition and perhaps helping them find employment, but not quite the same commitment to the proposition that the traditional institutions themselves should change. The core institutions of the society should change. And I can understand why, because that's actually tough politics, right, to change your core institutions. It was tough politics in this country. We tend to forget how much conflict surrounded especially the 1960s and 70s, when Canada changed the very definition of what this country was. We tended to think, certainly in English-speaking Canada, we tended to think of this as a British country. And we certainly thought of it as a European country. If you remember the old flag, it was a European flag, right? The British Jack in one corner, and the shield had the three sort of UK traditions represented in the Quebec fleur-de-lis, and there wasn't much recognition of the non-European, non-white, non-Christian elements of a potential society. Moving away from those core cultural symbols, I'm old enough to remember the flag debate. That was divisive, difficult politics, moving to a new conception of who we are as a people. But when we went through it, we developed a kind of less defined, more open conception of what a Canadian might be. And I think that has made it easier for us to absorb wider ranges of difference in later years. But it's not simple politics. I can remember Lester Pearson and the politics of that era as being pretty tough politics. So it's not surprising that what a two-way street means will differ from one country to another.
Yes, please.
Yes, I think cultural reciprocity is a very helpful idea, and it reinforces other similar ideas. I'd make 2 points about it. Firstly, I think that in kind of practical terms, it first manifests itself at a kind of local level. How people adjust, maybe in a local school, maybe in a local park, a neighborhood, and perhaps also a local authority policy adjustment that becomes more culturally sensitive. For instance, on which day a meeting takes place. Perhaps Friday afternoons are to be avoided because it's the Muslim holy day in the way that people recognize Sunday. It's the day of collective prayer for Muslims. So yes, that happens at a kind of local level, and teachers recognize that maybe it's not a good idea to have an important exam scheduled for the Hindu festival of Diwali, if some of the children won't be coming to school that day, or they will be otherwise inconvenienced. But I think the real challenge then begins when enough of that is happening in different localities, and people begin to have a wider discourse and begin to reflect on what cultural reciprocity or these kinds of changes mean at a more macro level. Typically a national level, but we could say at a European level, but at the moment we're just having these debates at a national level. And I think that also is important. We can't confine these debates to a local level. The British experience has been that we have, government policy has tended to push these things away from Westminster and Whitehall downwards to local levels. But in due course, they've bubbled back up into national politics, and then we do wrestle with them, and we do have dialogues about what does it mean to be British today in the light of all the changes that are taking place across different parts of the country, in different neighborhoods and urban areas and so on. And on the whole, I think we are having that debate, despite the speeches I was referring to. My strong feeling, based on collaborative research with European colleagues in cross-national research teams, is that some European countries haven't got to that point, or because of different traditions that they have about national identity, find it more difficult to think about how one can be French and Arab, or German and Muslim. But I think those are the kinds of debates we have to have, and we are now on the threshold of having, and have to take them through. And on that, my second point is that a very interesting, I think, a change has occurred in Britain, I mean, the bigger change, which I think is noticeable to everybody, is how we used to talk about race, meaning issues around, color and phenotype, black and white and so on. Then we moved to ethnicity, and now, of course, because of issues around Muslims, including their own political assertiveness, that's now in the frame, centrally in the frame. Well, one of the things that's happened that's in a way less commented on is, even though now people think we've reached a more divisive time, I mean, just relying on my own biography, I remember when race was the central kind of minority-defining identity dimension, actually there used to be an idea that if you're not white, then we all kind of are together something. We are black or ethnic minorities, whatever we might call it. But we are something, and the rest of the population is our other, partly because they've made us their other. So white and ethnic minorities, or white and black. But actually, you're not getting that with religion. Religion seems to be much more fraternal. Most of the political and civil society institutions that are crystallizing around majority-minority relations to do with religion are interfaith. And often Christians are an important player, or the major player. Of course, there's the Anglican Church, other Protestant churches, and the Catholic Church, and so on. And this is really interesting because English culture, in many ways, as you all know, is marked by a very high degree of a kind of adversarial quality. Our parliament, they shout at each other. Of course, in Europe, they're much more civilized. They sit in a crescent. But we like adversarial politics. Our courts, which of course are the same in Canada, are adversarial. You have the prosecution and you have the defense. If you've seen our television interrogators of politicians, they're highly adversarial. Perhaps some of you might recognize names like Jeremy Paxman. But religion is one of the least adversarial features of British society. It is, as I say, highly interfaith.
Okay, Tariq, thank you. We have a question over here.
Graham Fraser, Commissioner of Official Languages. I'd like to respond to a couple of things that Will Kymlicka said. He pointed out that the Ukrainians led the pressure to have a multiculturalism policy. This was in part because they felt pressured by the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, and the multiculturalism policy and the bilingualism policy were both the fruits of this same Royal Commission, with the result that many Quebec nationalists felt that multiculturalism was specifically designed to put down Quebec nationalism. You also said that multiculturalism is not a poison word in Canada. I would argue that in Quebec it has become a poison term. We've seen the rise of the reasonable accommodation debate, the Bouchard-Taylor hearings, and very valuable report, in my view, but also the emergence of what Gérard Bouchard and others call interculturalism, presented as an alternative model to multiculturalism, basically making the argument that Quebec, as a vulnerable culture and language, cannot afford to take the same view as is taken in English Canada. I'm wondering if you feel, and the three of you feel, what can be the relationship between the arguments for interculturalism and the policies of multiculturalism?
Thank you, Graham. Will?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the, there's a, I answer that at two levels. So there's a rhetorical level in which many Quebec nationalists take it as a matter of kind of fundamental principle that Quebec's approach must be different from the rest of Canada. That this is part of the commitment to being a distinct society is that we must have a different approach. And so Quebec cannot have a multiculturalism policy just because the federal government has one. It must have a different policy. And And so even if Quebec's actual policies, actual programming were identical to those of the federal government, they would still give it a different term. This is clear to my mind. And many scholars have argued that, in fact, there is virtually no difference in the actual programming that was conducted under interculturalism at the provincial level and multiculturalism at the federal level. In the Bouchard-Taylor report, they have a number of kind of footnotes where they try to explain that there's a grand philosophical difference between Quebec interculturalism and federal multiculturalism. But if you actually read those footnotes carefully, they all take the form of, some people would argue that. I mean, they're all hedged in such a way as to avoid making a clear stand on what exactly the difference is. But I think there is a difference, which is not actually the one that Bouchard-Taylor focuses on, but it's around secularism and laïcité, that because of the distinctive, because of the powerful role of the Catholic Church, because the Quiet Revolution was not just a revolution against Anglophone power, but also a revolution against the Catholic Church, that has generated a kind of anti-clericism in Quebec that's, of course, not unlike that in France, where again, the revolution was in part a revolution against the Church. And so that many people associate the progress of the Quiet Revolution with a very strict form of laïcité. Whereas in most of the rest of the country, people are more relaxed about not wholly relaxed, as we know from the debates about funding religious schools in Ontario and other debates, but there is a version of strict secularism in Quebec which doesn't have the same adherence in the rest of the country.
Could I address that?
Yes, by all means.
I certainly don't want to enter a local quarrel.
Go right ahead.
No. But it so happens that Will and I are debating this issue in print in a journal this very month. And, I mean, there is no more prominent a theorist of multiculturalism than Will Kymlicka, and probably no single individual that has done more to promote the idea of multiculturalism in many parts of the world. But when Will looks over the Atlantic at Western Europe as a whole perhaps, he does despair, and very understandably, he does despair about not just the possibilities of multiculturalism, but specifically about this poisoned term. And I understand that. That's not difficult at all. But I'm really not persuaded that interculturalism will somehow do the work that multiculturalism can no longer do because the term is poisoned, demonized, and so on. And this is partly because, you know, I referred to the 7 premiers that had made this multiculturalism is dead speech. Well, none of them favor interculturalism. They didn't say, oh, multiculturalism is dead, so long live interculturalism. I know Will's quite impressed by the fact that the Council of Europe, which after all does consist of 47 governments, they say they're for interculturalism. But you know, after they've signed a piece of paper at their summits and they go back to their domestic publics, they never mention it again. They talk about integration, community cohesion, possibly social cohesion, and so on. So interculturalism is not waiting in the wings or is being primed to replace, as it were, some of the substance of multiculturalism with a more acceptable sound or wrapping. What is true is that in some places in Western Europe, some of the policies that are being advocated or implemented are ones that probably the three of us would recognize as multiculturalist, but they call them interculturalism. Belgium is a very good example of that. And sometimes in education, schooling and so on. That's particularly the case in relation to pedagogy and curriculum and so on. They prefer to talk about interculturalism, especially in, say, Italy and Greece and Spain. So there are places in Europe where interculturalism is doing a certain amount of good work, as it were, but it's not really a major contender at this high level of this kind of life and death struggle about the term multiculturalism. But nor is any other term being favored. So, because I'm not stuck on one term, as I don't think anyone else is. If some other term could emerge that we'd say, well, look, that's actually got most of what we want when we talk about multiculturalism, and perhaps as kind of ironed out some of the misunderstanding and some of the biases and so on, because multiculturalism is not a static concept. I mean, we all work and write on multiculturalism, and we are constantly thinking forward. We're reviewing, we're responding to objections, offering new conceptualizations and so on. And that's just how it should be. No one should be arguing for something just because they came up with, there was such an idea in, you know, the early 1970s and so on. So, but I just don't see any other term that we could conveniently shift all that's good about multiculturalism into and say, let this be the new term.
Quite possibly could divert the debate as well. We had a question over here. We switched. Okay.
Hi, Jeff Cameron with the Baha'i Community of Canada. My question was partially answered already, but I'll ask it anyway. Professor Modood, you observe that the main axis of debate in Europe around multiculturalism has been religion. And so my question is just whether what does multiculturalism have to say, whether as an idea or as a set of policies about religion that's somehow distinct from racial or ethnic diversity?
Yes, well, I think that, and I think, you know, in many ways, my thinking on this matter actually does reflect the British experience. It's not just something like I've thought up in my office or something. So the immigration from outside Europe, mainly, you know, the Commonwealth countries like India, the Caribbean, West Africa, the presence of such people showed the presence of racism in British societies. So some politicians saw the need to combat that, and we began a process of legislation and policy specifically on racial discrimination. Over time, we realized that some of the things that were hurting some communities couldn't easily be captured in the idea of race. For instance, turban-wearing Sikh men wanted to be exempt from some new legislation in relation to motorcycle helmets or the wearing of hard hats on building sites, and in fact from certain uniforms at work, like a bus conductor or a bus driver uniform, and so on. So they campaigned for that, and we managed to find a way of using our race relations legislation. You know, the case went right up to the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, which we call the House of Lords, we used to anyway, and a decision was made that Sikhs were an ethnic group within the meaning of the law. Well, some people might say, well, that's surprising. We thought they were a religious group. But actually, they can be both. And one of the exemplary cases of that are the Jews. The Jews, of course, are a religious group, but everybody thinks anti-Semitism is racism. And all the politicians, all the legislators in the House of Commons that were passing the legislation, the initial Race Relations Act, said that they intended anti-Semitism to be caught by that. So Jews are regarded as a race, they're regarded as an ethnic group, they're regarded as a religious group. But when it came to discrimination against Muslims, British courts said, I'm sorry, we can't hear this case, take it away, because you are not a race, you're not an ethnic group, you are a religion. And Muslims agreed. They said, yes, we are a multi-ethnic global community of which we Britons are a part. So we clearly are not an ethnic group, like the Sikhs or the Jews. And so we needed a more explicit set of policies outlawing religious discrimination, which we didn't have at the time and later came to have, and so on. So the point of all that is that we've come to issues around religion and equality, religion and multiculturalism, through a process of extension. It's not that we just thought up some new policies. And the policies around religion, in many ways, mirror the other equality legislation. Of course, that's not the whole story, because then there are policies to do with public funding of certain kinds of schools. There are issues to do with, well, we have, an established church and so on, which I won't go into. But they create certain kinds of issues which are in addition. So what is certainly true is that once you begin to talk about what is it to be a Hindu or a Sikh and a Muslim, and to be a fully equal British citizen, you're talking about a wider agenda or a more complex set of issues. That is true, but I think that that actually is the nature of multiculturalism. That's not unique to religion. The multi in multiculturalism is a real word, is a real multi. There are issues to do with indigenous populations. There are groups defined through language heritage, groups defined through color and where they're from. And as I say, there are groups that are like Sikhs and Jews that are ethnic groups, religious groups, and so on. So I think multiculturalism is about accommodating religious minorities in a, as it were, a non-exceptional way. But nevertheless, I recognize that this will mean some amount of asymmetry. But I think it's an asymmetry that is at the heart of our idea of multiculturalism, because multiculturalism doesn't mean a single template. It means a sensitivity to group identities and accommodating groups in ways that they want to be accommodated, assuming it's consistent with liberal democratic norms.
Thank you. Interesting summary. Moving things along very smartly. We've got a question back here, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the light tie, and then the gentleman in the purple shirt, and then over there.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Marie-Christine Johnson. Je suis sûre.
I am Marie-Christine Johnson. I'm sure I'm not the only person here who is a product of a bicultural group.
In a bicultural long-term relationship. I'm very happy to be here because I am a very recent retiree. And I am in extreme exploration mode right now, seeking engagement in areas that are of huge interest to me. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. And Mr. Kymlicka, I quite identified with what you said about identities can be mutually complementary. I have learned so far in life that bicultural relationships, multicultural relationships take much more patience, much more conversations, much greater listening skills than when we're with somebody of the same category or culture, call it whatever. Because they're based on respect, interest, openness, and authenticity. As you were all speaking, I was coming up with my own little chart. And I thought, yeah, when we're so hung up on just integrating with the mainstream and keeping who's dominant today dominant forever, we are coming from protecting as opposed to building. We're basing ourselves on fear as opposed to confidence, on domination versus fraternity, suspicion versus trust. I do have a question.
Thank you.
I have a question, and it is this. What role do you see public education playing to move forward the multicultural mode of integration that Monsieur j'oublie votre nom, excusez-moi.
Kymlicka.
Yes, have identified. Because I've been living in that world for the past 35 years, and that's where it's really happening.
Take a number of questions together, given the
Why
time.
don't we do that?
Yeah.
Yes, let's hear them all. We've got 2 here and the 3rd one here. Let's just hear your questions and then we'll throw them to the panel.
Thank you. It's on. Okay. My name is Lalit Gunaratna. I just want to relate a quick personal story and then ask a question. When I landed as an immigrant in 1973, a 14-year-old, my first immigrant experience was to get beaten up by 3 youth on a sidewalk and to be called derogatory P word that was used against South Asians at the time. I didn't know what it meant. It deeply hurt me. It scared me. When I found out that what it meant and the seriousness of it, one day I was walking in the class in a school hallway, and I heard the name being called at me by another person standing in line to get into a class. So I reacted violently, and I slammed into him and onto the locker, which made a lot of noise. And the teachers came running out and grabbed me and was walking me to the principal's office until I told him what had happened. I said, this person called me this name. He quickly turned around, took me back, and grabbed this other boy. And once he authenticated my story, he stopped taking me to the principal, and he gave him a lecture about it. And then made us shake hands and made him apologize to me. So I realized now, when I didn't feel secure on the streets, I felt secure under the institution. And this happened to me several times in the school system, where teachers defended me and where the system looked after me. So I believe multiculturalism as an institution has worked beautifully in Canada to protect all of us. But at the same time, I also believe, I want to ask a question, turning everything on its head. Now, as a person who came as an immigrant, I have also moved a huge distance to become multicultural. How much do you think, now we talk about accepting multicultures, but do you think we should turn it on its head too for the new communities who are coming here to become bicultural and multicultural themselves and to be accepting of multicultures themselves? And often that's not the case.
Thank you. We have 2 more. Just questions, please, and then let's throw them out to the panel. Yes, the gentleman in the light tie and the gentleman in the purple shirt.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Jasper Kajavsky, and I am currently living in Hamilton, and I will admit to being a lawyer, but I hope nobody will hold that against me. And
can you speak into the
microphone, please? Thank you. And a question, please. Yes. So we have to move things along smartly here.
Because of such a fundamental support for the concept of pluralism, and I just want to thank the Global Center for existing, because it's at the center of what I think for many of us is a personal belief which is fundamental, which is the belief that we're all different but equal. And within that context, in terms of multiculturalism and the promotion of it, I'm wondering if the panel, what your feelings are about those parts of multiculturalism and pluralism, the belief in difference but equality, that are mandated, things like law, things that dictate how we act, how we behave, and those things that are part of what we believe, what's actually in our hearts and how we behave. I'm wondering what your views are with regards to any overlap, if any, between those things that dictate our behaviors and those things that dictate our thoughts.
Thank you. Last one here.
Yes, Robert Gould, Center for European Studies at Carleton University. One quick comment. On the 25th and 26th of this month, we have a conference precisely on this topic, on inclusion and exclusion in Europe. Now, with questions, I'd like to follow up the remark by Tariq Modood that religion in the United Kingdom
is not adversarial. And I've got a question or questions arising from that for all members of the panel. For something over 10 years now, I've been following the way that parliamentarians speak of national identity and immigration. And I have been looking carefully at the debates in Germany on the headscarf case and the debates in Belgium and France on the face veil cases in 2010, 2011. And my conclusion from that is that in those cases, religion is extremely adversarial, in that a very liberal view, a very liberal judgment of the Constitutional Court in Germany was subverted by politicians who see Islam in contradiction to German identity, just as parliamentarians in France clearly now see Islam in contradiction to the principles of the French state. In Belgium, it's the same. So that now we have the view that the Republic in France is defining itself no longer in contradiction to Catholicism, as it did 100 years ago, but now in contradiction to Islam. So I'd like the views of the panel members on that.
Why don't we very briefly start this, because it's nice to be able to hit all of the questions.
To save time, I'll respond to the two questions that were addressed to me. And those are the questions about public education, the role of publication and religion, the adversarial character of religion today in Europe. I certainly think public education has a very important role to play in multiculturalism. And in fact, in most countries, not necessarily in Canada, Canada is a little bit unusual, but in most countries, multiculturalism as a policy idea began in the policy field of education. And still, if you look at the number of publications and multiculturalism and so on, education is the single biggest topic area. So what one teaches the next generation and what the possibility is of transmitting a minority identity to the next generation and so on. I mean, those are absolutely central to multiculturalism and public education, therefore, as well. In an earlier meeting today, I went on, perhaps for too long, about the importance of how we Europeans have to rethink what it is to be Europeans, because we have a very blinkered, prejudiced view of our history. You know, the dominant narrative that Europeans are taught, basically, you know, from Athens to what used to be called Plato to NATO. Perhaps we've moved beyond NATO, I don't know. But, you know, the European Union has a history that it tells, that it begins with Athens and culminates in Brussels. Well, actually, Muslims have been a very important part of Europe and of European history over many centuries through their own societies there, but also the contribution that they made to European learning and the development of ideas, the development of Christian ideas, scientific ideas, the Renaissance, and so on. So yes, it's absolutely crucial. I can see the chair's looking a little bit anxious about time, so I'll turn to the religion.
You have a plane to catch.
Religion, yes, that's true as well. Yeah, you're quite right. The degree of public aggression around certain Muslim practices, or just Muslims in general, is at a very dangerous level across the whole of Western Europe, including Britain, though I think the examples that you gave of Germany and France are very apt, because the degrees of, as it were, publicly sanctioned aggression and laws banning various forms of Muslim headdress and so on are being implemented there. I meant that religion isn't very adversarial, meaning amongst religious people. I didn't mean that no religious group was being singled out by the public as a whole. I mean, if you think about this, what's referred to as the new atheism, Dawkins and people like that, actually, there isn't really a religious equivalent. There are a lot of people saying that Muslims are about to take over the European continent, and in the United States, some of them are evangelical Christians, but actually, it's radical secularists that are the doomsayers and the Islamophobic prophets in Western Europe, not the Christians. Well, possibly Pope Benedict, it might be a marginal figure.
Very brief closing thoughts from Keith and Will addressing some of these points.
I'll be very quick. I think the public education story is an important part of the story. I think the educational system is undoubtedly the most powerful integrative mechanism that we have. That it is one of the things about the Canadian experience that's been distinctive is the success of second generation, that is children born of immigrants in Canada, and their success in the educational system. With some exceptions, they have tended to outperform the traditional host population's children. And what is interesting, an OECD study of that pointed to the role of multiculturalism policies in that context, because some would say Canada is relatively successful in this process of educating the children of immigrants because the immigrants themselves have high levels of education. And the one thing we know from studies of educational attainment is the biggest single driver is the educational attainment of the parents, right? And so one could look at the Canadian experience and say, it's nothing, it's just, that's all it is. It's just a reflection of your immigration policy. But the OECD did a nice study comparing educational attainment of second-generation children across OECD countries, and they held constant, that is in their study, in their statistical analysis, they held constant the educational level of parents. And they still found that the children of immigrants in Canada were doing better than one would expect given their parents' educational level, and they put it down to the kind of multicultural context and the kind of legitimation of those children and difference is part of why they were doing as well as they were. So I think it's a powerful instrument in this country. It's one we don't pay enough attention to. And I think the multicultural component works there. I mean, Will was talking earlier about areas where it seems to work. He talked about political involvement of the Vietnamese population in Toronto versus Boston, but I think you can see it in the educational component as well. On the gentleman's question about whether we expect newcomers to embrace multiculturalism, I think that was the question. I think one would hope that would be the case, and if you actually look at survey evidence of the attitudes of Canadians, newcomers do tend to embrace the kind of Canadian ethos quite quickly. If you ask what elements of the country you are proud of, the responses from immigrants who have been here for a while and the responses of the long settled population are about the same. And multiculturalism is identified as something that immigrants value. So I think it's a good idea. It would be nice if it's true, and I think it actually is true. So I think we don't have to worry, I hope. And I'm not sure I understood the gentleman's question here about the relationship of whether we care about the thoughts in our head or our behavior. I think that was the question. What I would say is that clearly behavior matters a lot. And in the first instance, the state has to worry about the behavior of individuals. So there was a case got a lot of attention in Kingston recently, a case referred to as an honor killing. Clearly in the first instance, the state, in the form of the legal system, has to make clear that's totally unacceptable and in fact the system did, and those people are in jail and will be in jail for a long time. Ideally, one would also get at the cultural attitudes towards women and towards young people that led there, which seems to have led there. That's a tougher haul, and I think this is where Will's gravitational pull of liberal democratic institutions over time, I think can have effect, perhaps not always in the first generation, but certainly in the second generation. So the state really, I don't think can try and necessarily shape minds, but at a minimum it has to control behavior, and just hope that the processes of engagement will in time change the attitudes as well.
Thank you, Keith, and Will, I think it's fitting to close with you.
Just one quick comment on the question of whether we expect newcomers to embrace multiculturalism. As Keith said, statistically, that seems to be happening, but I actually think there is a serious question here that if you look at studies of prejudice in Canada, partly because we too have been shaped by a particular kind of American rhetoric of black-white racial divide, we tend to assume that prejudice takes the form of whites being prejudiced against non-whites, and there's certainly a lot of that. But we haven't explored as much the extent to which some non-white groups are prejudiced against other non-white groups. And the evidence that has been done on that is not always reassuring. And so, for example, on issues about attitudes towards Aboriginals in Canada, it's sometimes immigrants from East Asia who are more prejudiced against Aboriginals than people of European descent. And we have not, I would say that we haven't had an honest and forthright a discussion about that as we should. I mean, I think immigrants embrace multiculturalism as a way of being included, but we haven't always made clear what responsibilities it imposes on them in the way they treat other minorities. And, yeah.
Thank you very much. Clearly the beginning of a long discussion, I think, for another day. Thank you to all of you for your very smart questions, and thank you to our panelists for your thoughtful answers. I'd like to pass the floor back to John now.
Well, I think we would all agree that this has been a very stimulating and thoughtful discussion, and that's thanks to our three experts and to Susan for making it so. I would also like to thank all of you, whom I consider to be the friends of the Global Center for Pluralism, for being a very attentive and engaged group. I hope you'll come back to future events. And now I'd like you to invite you all to a reception. We turn around the other part of the atrium, and we have a chance to meet each other and to continue the discussion. And again, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thanks.